Welcome to everyone who is joining our time together today. Um, I'm going to share with you the story of this remarkable woman and something of the impact that she has had on many people. I stumbled onto Charlotte when I was executive director of American Baptist International Ministries. We were preparing to mark the 200th anniversary of International Ministries, the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society, in 2014. In preparation for that, I was doing particular research in the early days of our mission. We had always spoken of a particular couple, Adoniram Judson and his wife Anne, and a colleague, Luther Rice, as being the first missionaries appointed by American Baptists in 1814. But I discovered as I read more closely that Anne Judson, Adoniram's wife, was not appointed. Um, and I then discovered that all the missionary wives following her were sent but not appointed. Nevertheless, I discovered that the year after the appointment of Luther Rice and the Judsons, in 1815, there appeared in our records the name of one Charlotte White, and then another entry of Charlotte Rowe, the very same person, who was appointed in 1815. And I wondered to myself, who is this person? The more I worked on this, I realized that she is the first woman from America to be officially appointed as a missionary by any denomination or any mission agency. And yet I was wondering, who is she? Why have I not heard of her? Where did she serve? Um, this was just a blank. So I began my research and in the process discovered a fascinating individual and an individual who was immersed in scandal at a number of points in her life and ministry. Charlotte was born in 1782, the last child, the 11th child, born to William Augustus Atlee and his wife Esther. Uh, Three of the children had already died in infancy by the time Charlotte was born in 1782. So she grew up with seven siblings rather than with 10. She was baptized at St. James Church. Her father and mother were prominent members of St. James Anglican Church at that time. Um, Her father was a longtime warden of the church, and she was born just at the end of the American Revolution. Her father had been an ardent patriot, deeply involved in support of the American cause in the Revolution. Her childhood seems to have been a somewhat privileged one, as one might expect from a very prominent family. By the time of her birth, her father was a participant on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and would be named as the president judge for the First Judicial District of Pennsylvania. He was also a trustee of the University of Pennsylvania. Their home was described by one person as, and I'm quoting, the resort of beauty and intelligence of the surrounding country. Although we don't know specifics about the education that Charlotte received as a young child, certainly as a child of a prominent judge, she received very significant education, even as a girl, although many girls were not being educated at that time. Charlotte's life, however, began to be touched by sorrow. When she was 8 years old, Charlotte experienced the death of her mother, Esther. And then 3 years later, 1793, her father died. Cholera had broken out in Philadelphia. It was a major epidemic. An estimated 50% of the population died as a result of that cholera, or the yellow fever, I should say, yellow fever epidemic. Um, our national government, of course, was located in Philadelphia at the time. George Washington and the Congress fled the city and moved to Germantown to stay away from all of the illness. But William Atlee had traveled to Philadelphia as part of his duties related to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And there he contracted yellow fever and died. The year was 1793. Charlotte was now an orphan at 11 years of age. As far as we can tell, Charlotte moved to join the family of her oldest sister, who was also named Esther and was 14 years older than Charlotte. Charlotte's sister lived in Rutland, Massachusetts, a small town right in the middle of the state of Massachusetts. She presumably continued her education in Rutland. And there in Rutland, when Charlotte was 21 years old, she became married. She married a man named Nathaniel White, who also resided in Rutland, Massachusetts, and was a merchant in that town. So now Charlotte Hazen Atlee had become Charlotte Hazen Atlee White. They were married in 1803. Shortly there, at the end of that next year, they welcomed a baby boy into their family. But shortly after the birth of that little boy, Nathaniel, Charlotte's husband, died. He died on Christmas Day of 1804. And tragically, 5 months later, the little boy also died. In the midst of that double trauma of the deaths of her husband and their only son, Charlotte moved from Rutland, Massachusetts to Haverhill, about 60 miles north of Boston. We don't know exactly why she moved to Haverhill. It may be because many of her husband's relatives lived there. It's also possible that she may have felt that there were better employment opportunities. Haverhill was about twice the size of Rutland. But when she went to Haverhill, she experienced a spiritual renewal that she referred to as her conversion. She encountered the Baptist church in Haverhill and joined that church by being baptized as an adult by immersion in the Merrimack River. Her baptism also became an event that some in town thought was somewhat scandalous. It was not because Baptists were immersing uh, believers in the Merrimack, but it was because when Charlotte waded into the Merrimack River, about to be baptized, she spontaneously broke into song, singing a hymn of praise to God. A local Congregationalist lawyer, Leverett Saltonstall, recorded in his diary that he had witnessed the baptism, and he thought that Charlotte bursting into song was, and I quote, unusual and unnecessary. He thought she might have been sincere, but it seemed a little ostentatious to him. So even in her baptism in Massachusetts, she was touched by scandal. At the Baptist Church in Haverhill, Charlotte encountered much activity related to foreign mission. That local church had a society, a foreign mission society, that was focused on prayer and support of the British Baptists who were doing missionary work in India, just north of Calcutta. The pastor of the church was very much involved in supporting local missionaries to the frontier. And Charlotte became extremely interested in foreign mission. She also uh, would have heard of all the chatter about two young women in the neighborhood. In her town of Haverhill, there was a young woman named Harriet Atwood. Just south across the Merrimack River in the town of Bradford was another young woman named Anne Hasseltine. These two Congregationalist women experienced a renewal of faith and also experienced marriage proposals by two young men, both of whom had felt themselves called to foreign mission as Congregationalist missionaries. Both Harriet, who married Samuel Newell, and Anne, who married Adoniram Judson, knew that to accept these proposals of marriage, they were accepting a call to mission service as well. And that was rather scandalous for local people to think of these young women who they knew very well traveling across the ocean to live in India, knowing that they probably would never again see either in this life. Charlotte could not have failed to hear the buzz of about these two women. In 1812, um, the husbands of Harriet and Anne, along with three other Congregationalists, so five men altogether and three wives, went to Salem, Massachusetts, where the five men were ordained and commissioned, appointed as Congregationalist missionaries. Even though the Congregationalists were sending the five men and the three wives, none of the wives were appointed. They were being sent as volunteers to basically assist their husbands because the husbands were considered to be the missionaries. That happened in 1812. The following year, Charlotte moved from Haverhill to Philadelphia. There she joined the Sampson Street Baptist Church. It was a church that was well known, even though it was quite a young congregation. It had only formed 2 years earlier. It was well known because of its architecture. The church was built in the shape of a rotunda, and it was also well known because of its pastor, William Stoughton, who was a very influential, widely known public speaker in Philadelphia and was deeply committed to foreign mission. He and his wife, Maria, had originally come from England. He had helped organize the British Baptist Missionary Society. He had helped to choose and send William Carey as the first British Baptist missionary to India, then had moved to the United States, and now had become the pastor of the new Sampson Street Baptist Church. News took considerable period of time to travel from India to the United States. Reverend Stoughton was in the habit of writing to William Carey and the other British Baptist missionaries. Letters took about 4 to 5 months to travel each way. And so he and others were surprised when they received news that Adoniram Judson and his wife Anne and their colleague Luther Rice, upon their arrival in India and meeting with the British Baptists, themselves had come to Baptist views in terms of baptism and had become immersed by one of the British Baptist missionaries. And now, in fact, were no longer Congregationalist missionaries, but were Baptist missionaries. They were Baptist missionaries, but there was no mission organization to support them. And so William Stoughton and others went to work, and in 1814, they formed the first of the national organizations uniting Baptists on a national basis in the United States. It was called the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist Denomination in the United States of America for Foreign Missions, a very catchy title. That convention also immediately formed a board of managers called the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions, 21 men who would meet monthly and conduct the ongoing business of the mission. At their first meeting in 1814, they appointed Adoniram Judson and Luther Rice as their first missionaries. They did not appoint Anne, the wife. She again was considered to be a volunteer, an assistant to her husband. 5 weeks after the Baptist Board of Foreign Missions was organized, Charlotte White and Maria Stoughton, the wife of the pastor, along with a number of other women from Sampson Street Church, met in the Stoughton home and formed a women's organization called the Sampson Street Baptist Female Society for Propagating Evangelical Missions. Their goal was to pray for the British mission in India, to gather funds to help support it, and also to pray for mission work on the American frontier. It was during that time that Charlotte became one of the leaders of that woman's mission society in her local church. By now, the Judsons were not in India, but were in Burma. They had begun translating the scriptures and religious tracts into Burmese, and they needed a way to publish the scriptures and other religious literature. So they requested that the American Baptist Board would send someone who had the skills of being a printer. A Baptist minister named George Howe arrived in Philadelphia along with his wife Phoebe. Reverend Howe had been a printer before he had started his pastoral ministry. He applied for and was appointed to missionary service to go to Burma and to be a printer, printing the works of the Judsons. He was appointed in the summer of 1815. Charlotte, by now, was very clear in her sense that God was calling her to mission work. She talked with George and Phoebe Howe about the possibility of traveling with them to India. She wrote a letter of application to the Baptist Board and officially requested appointment. And so in the summer of 1815, Charlotte was also appointed as a missionary. She would be sent with the Howes to Burma to work alongside the Judsons. Now, I mentioned that this Baptist board met on a monthly basis and was comprised of 21 men. But the 21 people who were part of the board were scattered in states from New York to Georgia. And so most of them could not be present for the board meetings. As a result, the board's constitution specified that a quorum of 7 board members could act on behalf of the full board. Previous to this, all of the actions of the Baptist board had been unanimous, but that was not the case with the appointment of Charlotte White. At least one prominent member of the board opposed her appointment. That prominent individual was Reverend Henry Holcomb, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Philadelphia. Reverend Holcomb felt that it was improper for a woman to be appointed as a missionary. She was, after all, not male, she was not ordained, she was not a preacher. Therefore, she didn't qualify. However, the majority of that quorum had felt that she should be appointed. Reverend Holcomb apparently argued that if all 21 members of the board had been present in the meeting, the vote on Charlotte White would never have passed. So, although the vote was legal, the rest of the quorum decided that they would poll all 21 members. It would take over a month for letters to be sent up to New York and down to Georgia and to states intervening to ask the question, was it in accordance with the board's constitution to appoint Charlotte White? As the answers came back, it became apparent that a majority of the board agreed that the constitution of the society did not define the word missionary. Therefore, it did not restrict missionary appointment to ordained persons, nor did it restrict appointment to men. Therefore, Charlotte's appointment would stand. However, Several of the board members, in writing that they could not object to her appointment as an unordained woman, nevertheless raised the question, do we really have enough money to send her? Well, in this, Charlotte was very wise. She had a small um, estate. We don't know if part of that estate was inherited at the death of her parents, or part of it might have been inherited at the death of her husband, Mr. White, but she had a modest estate. And Charlotte pledged to contribute much of that uh, estate to the Baptist board with the idea that they would use those funds to pay for her expenses. In other words, she was volunteering to self fund her own ministry. But with her contribution, that removed the financial objection that some people had. And so now Charlotte was ready to sail to Asia. In December of 1815, the ship left from Philadelphia. It went down the Delaware to Newark, crossed the ocean. It took 4.5 months at sea, and finally they arrived in Calcutta. I'm going to show you my ineptitude at the technology as I now attempt to share with you a few views to illustrate the next part of this talk. Charlotte and the Howes arrived at Calcutta, now referred to as Kolkata, and then they immediately went up the Ganges, or actually the Hooghly River, which is what this part of the river is called, to the community of Serampore. The British Baptists had settled in Serampore for a political reason. The British East India Company was in control of colonial India. And the East India Company did not want any evangelical missionaries to be involved in the area. They were afraid that if people were talking to local folks about the Christian faith, that might upset local people. And if local people became upset, then that would imperil the profits of the company. So they weren't about to allow the British Baptists or any other evangelical missionaries to remain in India. However, just a few miles up the river from Calcutta was the community of Serampore. That was a small colony of Denmark, the King of Denmark. And the Danes were willing to allow the British Baptists to establish their mission station in Serampore. So Charlotte went from Calcutta up to Serampore, where she met William Carey, William Ward, Joshua Marshman, other British Baptist missionaries, and began to learn about the work of serving in mission. They had particularly needed to stop here because William Carey was donating a printing press to the Judsons who were at work in Rangoon, Burma. Now, it took 2 months for them to find a ship that would go from Calcutta to Rangoon. During that 2-month period, Charlotte met another British Baptist missionary named Joshua Rowe. Joshua Rowe had been in India for a number of years with his first wife, but several years prior to Charlotte's arrival, Joshua Rowe's first wife died, leaving him a widower with 3 small boys. During that 3 months, as they were awaiting a ship that could take them to Burma, Charlotte and Joshua were married. Their ceremony took place at the St. John Anglican Cathedral in Calcutta, and then they went from Serampore north to the community of Digha. It's about 360 miles north and west of Calcutta, and you can see that it's just on the southern bank of the Ganges. Now, Charlotte now was no longer continuing with the idea of traveling to Burma to work under the American Baptists, but she was remaining in India to work under the British Baptists. When she got to Diga, she discovered that this was really a relatively small uh, village of about 500. But 10 miles away to the east was the larger city of Patna. Patna was a major center of commerce for the East India Company. Goods from all over the northern part of India would be brought to Patna and then shipped down the Ganges and shipped off to be back to England or to be sold elsewhere. Uh, Patna was also the center of opium trade, which the East India Company managed to sell with a monopoly on it. So a large number of English people lived in Patna. To the west of the village of Diga was another town called Dinapur. This town was not quite as large as Patna, but it was very significant because it was the place of a cantonment of British troops. You see here a map that shows the barracks, large barracks. The barracks would be filled sometimes with British military, and sometimes it would be filled with soldiers that uh, answered to the East India Company. So as a result, both on the east in Patna and on the west in Dinapur, there were large numbers of English-speaking people. You may notice on this map right here between the barracks and the river, you see a chapel. I'm going to refer to that chapel a little later on. But uh, beside Dinapur, about a mile away, was the village of Diga. In 1824, Charlotte drew this map of the British mission compound. It shows the Ganges River here. It shows a terrace, a garden, and two bungalows. The larger bungalow, which was used by local workers and on some occasions was rented out as a source of income, and the smaller bungalow in the center where the Rowe family lived. Charlotte and her husband, Joshua, were right at work in Diga. And of course, Charlotte's first task was to learn the local language. Her husband had learned Bengali when he was living in Serampore, and indeed had preached in Bengali. But when they moved north to what was known as Hindustan, now they were in a different language sphere. Joshua Rowe studied Hindi, but never became fluent in it. But Charlotte, however, was a remarkable linguist. She relatively soon became fluent in Hindi and was able to begin teaching students in that language. She would uh, begin her work now uh, of establishing schools. And one of the things that she was concerned about was that schools would be established for girls as well as for boys. She would be carried out of Diga to surrounding villages in a palanquin, such as this. She would meet with local leaders, talk with them about starting a school for the children. Um, Usually, a local landowner would donate a plot of land on which a school building could be constructed. And then she would have to get a teacher for the school. Now, it wasn't so difficult to get a teacher for boys, but she needed women teachers for the girls. And so, as she was teaching girls, she also taught adult women and recruited some of them to be the teachers of the women's schools. Most of the schools were made out of bamboo with grass roofs, much like this. You'll want to keep this view in mind as we talk about Charlotte's work. Charlotte was starting schools, as I've said. She was training teachers. She was doing some of the teaching herself. Um, but she struggled because there were very few resources to use to teach the children. So as a result, she wrote a spelling book in Hindi, the title of which was Mool Sutra. She also authored a Hindi grammar, and she used these books, the spelling book and the grammar, as tools in the teaching that she was doing. In the meantime, British soldiers from the cantonment, from Dinapore, would walk over to Diga on Sunday mornings and hear her husband preach in English. His ministry in Diga continued to be an English language ministry while Charlotte was working in Hindi. After a while, the soldiers felt that it would be more conducive to have a um, have a chapel right on the cantonment, and so they got permission for that to be built, and they built a building again, much like this, made out of bamboo and grass, and it was dubbed the Grass Tabernacle. So on Sunday mornings, Joshua would walk over to Dinapore, to the cantonment, preach in English in the Grass Tabernacle. Uh, Charlotte would meet with Hindi-speaking people for worship services in Diga, and so they continued their work in those separate language spheres. As they continued their work, uh, scandal and problems continued to follow them, and it followed in a most unusual way. Charlotte was in the habit of writing letters to one of her brothers, her brother Edwin Augustus Atlee, who was a physician in Philadelphia. She was very close to that brother, and she often confided concerns that she had in the letters that she wrote to him. But she asked her brother to treat those letters as confidential. Now, it turned out that there arose a bit of a controversy in Serampore concerning property. The British Baptists by now had a fair amount of property. They had started a school, they'd started a college, they'd started a printing press, a number of other things. Most of that land and most of those buildings were funded by secular work that William Carey and the others had done. So then the question was, who owned those properties? The Baptist Missionary Society in London felt that they owned it. The missionaries in Serampore felt they were the owners. And so that was controversial. And Charlotte and Joshua, of course, were hearing only bits and pieces of this conversation. Charlotte wrote to her brother Edwin in Philadelphia and had some somewhat critical remarks that she confided about William Carey, that she confided in a letter with her brother. The next thing they knew, Charlotte and Joshua received a stern letter from London scolding them for advertising criticisms of William Carey and the missionaries in Serampore, and informing them that her criticisms had been even published in an American newspaper. Well, Charlotte, of course, and Joshua were dumbfounded. She wrote to her brother to ask, what is going on? Explain. We don't know what newspaper is being referred to. We don't know what was placed in the paper. Her brother wrote back, and it became clear that he had not honored the confidentiality of some of her letters, particularly the letter that had been critical of William Carey. Instead, he had shown that letter to the editor of a small newspaper in Philadelphia called The Reformer. And as you can see, the editor of The Reformer was opposed to any organized religious organizations. He thought that seminaries, that Bible societies, that mission societies were basically schemes to earn money, and he devoted the Reformer to printing scandalous materials about ministers and churches and seminaries, including Princeton Seminary, uh, and now the Careys in Serampore. Well, uh, Charlotte was dumbfounded. This scandal of her letter being circulated in the United States, and the fact that her dear brother had not been willing to honor confidentiality. Um, so the Rowes felt that the confidence had been not respected. Shortly thereafter, another difficulty hit the Rowe household. Joshua became very sick. He had been to Patna. He had been to a community just outside of Patna. He had been doing some preaching. He caught a cold. He became sick on the way home. His illness increased, and he died. This now left Charlotte as a single missionary in Diga. By this time, she and Joshua had had three more children, twin girls and a little boy. So she was now the only missionary at the Diga station. She was a single parent of 6 children. She was the overseer not only of the Baptist mission station, but of 7 Hindi language schools, a Hindi language church. She was the overseer of 2 local indigenous evangelists, and she herself was deathly ill. She took the children to Calcutta and spent several months there in recovery. The 3 older boys now were middle to older teens, and she was able to secure apprenticeships for them in Calcutta. She returned to Diga to continue the mission work, bringing the twin girls and the little boy. By the time she got back to Diga, everything was disrupted. She had to repair the buildings. Uh, the Ganges River was continuing to erode the mission station. Buildings were falling into the river. But still, she carried on, still self-funding. She also had to take on all of the administrative work of the Diga mission. So she was writing letters to the Baptist Missionary Society in London. Her letters would take about 5 months to go from the post office in Dinapore to get to London, and a similar 5 months for a response to come. Finally, the difficulties of working in Diga were becoming almost impossible. All 3 children became very, very sick. The little boy almost died. Charlotte herself struggled with that. And then she began to have financial difficulties. For 11 years, she had been funding her own mission work, but now it was no longer financially sustainable. And so she took the children and paid her own way, sailed from, determined that she would sail from Calcutta to, um, to London to talk with the British Mission Society. She traveled down the Ganges River in a boat like this, which is called a budgerow. As she was making her way down the river, they encountered a widow who was about to throw herself on the funeral pyre of her dead husband. Charlotte's boat pulled over to the shore, and she tried to dissuade the widow of committing sati, but the widow's relatives were around and were urging her to do that, and so Charlotte was unsuccessful. She went to Calcutta, she boarded another ship, she went to London, she went immediately to the Baptist Missionary Society offices and proposed that they appoint her as a missionary, just as the Americans had officially appointed her. She then could have a modest salary from them and could return to India to continue her work. However, the British Baptists were not appointing women missionaries, just as the Americans had not been appointing women. She stayed for another 3 years in England, raising money till finally she could afford to uh, pay passage for herself and the three children to return to the United States. In the United States, she moved to uh, Philadelphia, resettled in Philadelphia. There, she started a small school. She advertised the school in a local newspaper. It was a school for girls. By now, the one of the twin girls was able to give some assistance in the schoolwork. She taught in Philadelphia for several years. Then, by 1835, she moved to Alabama. And she and again, one of the twins taught in an academy in Alabama. In 1845, the issue of slavery created a split among the Baptists, with Baptists in the South breaking fellowship from Baptists in the North. And Charlotte returned north to Pennsylvania. In 1850, she was in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, about 9 miles south of Lancaster, where she and one of the daughters were teaching at the Strasburg Female Seminary. Then tragedy hit again. In 1951, her daughter Esther Anna died. The next year, 1852, Charlotte Elizabeth died. Both girls were buried in the St. James Church Cemetery in Lancaster. Charlotte was now 70 years old. She returned to Philadelphia and lived the rest of her life in Philadelphia. On Christmas Day, 1863, at age 82, Charlotte Rowe died. The body was taken to Lancaster. Um, she was buried alongside the two girls in an unmarked grave here just beside their tombstone. Charlotte then basically disappeared from sight. The mission compound in Diga disappeared from sight. The Ganges River had continued to erode it, and it finally collapsed into the river. Nothing would remain of Charlotte except her signature on letters that are kept by the British Missionary Society in Oxford. As histories of Baptist mission were written in the succeeding years, Charlotte's name was never mentioned. People would mention George Howe. They would mention other Baptist missionaries that went to Burma and other places. But Charlotte was overlooked. She was omitted. Uh, the books were silent. It was not until starting in the 1950s and then increasingly in the 1960s and 70s when researchers began doing women's studies that Charlotte began to be mentioned. But even then, most of the mentions about her were incomplete and inaccurate. And only now, as we have done research on her letters and have done research in England and in India and in the United States, have we been able to understand more fully the significance of her life. Charlotte Hazen Atlee White Rowe, the first American woman who was officially appointed as a foreign missionary, a woman who broke open the door for other women to eventually be able to follow her, a woman who was a skilled linguist, a woman who said of herself, I'm but a mere instrument in God's hand. And if God uses me not, then I am nothing. Friends, thank you for listening as I have shared with you this portion of Charlotte's life.